Jenna said, I'm the PM for our accessibility product here at Cypress. And in this talk, we're going to go through things about that product itself a little bit later, but also just the topic of accessibility. I want to make sure that if you're listening to this, you can figure out if this is something that applies to you, if this is going to be something that, that your organization needs to think about and what the concerns are, especially in light of the European Accessibility Act. And then we'll get into some actual debugging, talk about how accessibility relates to quality and just things that you might need to know or be interested in to get started. To start with, though, we're going to look at what accessibility itself is, and the way that I think about this is that accessibility is a way of thinking about the web itself that prioritizes the needs of people with disabilities. So you can find lots of definitions related to compliance and ticking the boxes and just making everything behave in a certain way to get a certification or something. A lot of those can tend to distract us from the main thing, which is the people who are trying to use software and need it to be written in a certain way to meet their needs. This extends to designing and developing our software and how we think about quality. We think about software being accessible by virtue of the way we write the HTML and the way we frame what's going on, so that somebody using assistive technology like a screen reader or voice control is going to be able to operate that same software that we've developed. And an important thing to note is accessibility is an ongoing effort. It's not a one-time fix. This is sometimes described as being a process instead of being a project. You're not going to just do an accessibility project and then be ready and accessible kind of from day one. There's more to it than that. It needs to be an ongoing effort because code is changing all the time and needs to be maintained in an accessible way. So to zoom out a little bit, sometimes if people are learning about accessibility for the first time, it's tempting to think about how many people does this affect, and what's the perception of who has a disability and things like that. And what I've heard sometimes is people describe this as an edge case where sometimes the software is not working, sometimes for some people, but really for somebody who has a disability, it's often permanent and they often can't use the software. It's fully broken for them, just the same as if it has a full bug. So the CDC reports that up to 1 in 4 adults has some form of disability. These can be visible and noticeable. These can be invisible. They can affect your life in various different ways. But disability is really, really common. And a lot of us are facing disabilities as we age, even if we don't have any right now. As a part of old age, there seem to be some issues that come with that. How is accessibility related to quality? So this is a topic I care a lot about. I was a front-end developer before I was a product manager. And so I worked in front-end, and before I did all of that front-end work, I worked for about 7 years in a disability services nonprofit. I worked with adults with developmental disabilities as a job coach and daily living instructor and things like that. And so my background there showed me the impact of accessibility in the daily lives of people who rely on software to do various things. A great example is when people went to work and they used to have punch cards, and the punch cards were quite accessible. You just put it in there and it did its thing, right? You could clock in with your punch card, it would write the time on there. You had done it correctly every time. That switched to thumb scanners and touch screens and interfaces and usernames and passwords, and a lot of these things in the last 10 years have made it more difficult and less accessible to do a simple action like clocking into work. That same thing where software makes things more complicated and introduces barriers applies in multiple different contexts. And accessibility to me is a really good focal point to clean that up in our work as we design and develop software. So just being accessible in itself has some benefits. First of all, it helps us to meet user needs. If we think about when somebody describes, is an organization going to prioritize accessibility? They may say, we don't think we serve a population that has disabilities. I've heard that numerous times. And that's almost never true. And it certainly can't be proven that you don't have disabled people in your audience or in your software user base. Disabilities can be acquired at any time. You can have a temporary or a permanent disability, even if you're 100%, you only served like 5 people and they all didn't have anything that needed accessibility today. There's no guarantee that's always going to stay there. So your software should remain functional through changes in the people that use it, just as much as how you picture those people today. Improving code is another benefit of just being accessible. When we see applications that are not accessible, it's kind of rooted in the HTML and the document structure quite often, and we'll show how you can fix some of these things later in the talk. But mainly, poor accessibility often comes from reinventing the wheel and just kind of implementing patterns using generic elements like divs and spans that don't offer any accessible features with them. And so you can have better code, more intentional, easier to read code by being accessible. Managing risk is another area that businesses are interested in specifically. When we look at accessibility from a risk management perspective, some organizations, and the ones that I've worked with who care a lot about accessibility now, got there by having a lawsuit or a demand letter or something come in the door. And then people are kind of running around finding out who's responsible for accessibility, who's responsible for the right code being in the website that is causing this lawsuit or this demand letter to come in. You can end up with a scenario that's a bit like the Spider-Man meme of everybody pointing at each other because sometimes nobody really owns it. And those organizations develop a kind of mature process to protect themselves from future risk like that. You don't have to wait for that to happen. You can manage risk proactively by dealing with accessibility earlier in your process. This is the shift left argument, and it applies equally to accessibility. So this is something that every organization can proactively tackle as well. And finally, testing is simpler. If your code is accessible following standard user interface patterns, it's going to be more consistent code. It's going to be easier to grab with certain locator strategies. And of course, accessibility tests that we'll talk about are going to work better with code that starts out at least trying to do the right thing and be accessible. So I mentioned in the talk description, the European Accessibility Act is coming soon, and we're going to talk about what that might mean for software companies. So this is what it looks like. It's a document, like a long legal document, nothing exciting there. It applies to companies above, say, 10 employees and with a certain amount of turnover, and it takes effect June 28th, 2025. It doesn't matter where your company is located physically, it matters what customers you serve. So if you are doing business with people in the EU, this law may affect you. The most recent thing that comes to mind is these cookie banners that maybe 10 years ago started to become something businesses were interested in doing as a result of the General Data Protection Regulation. And that causes this sort of thing to happen all the time, where you have a website you want to get into and you get interrupted for these privacy notifications and cookie banners and stuff like that. I sort of predict a similar effect on accessibility for businesses, where people are going to, maybe if they don't care that much about it, they're going to shrug their shoulders, roll their eyes, and say, well, we got to do this because this is the law. The Act requires the products and services of companies doing business in the EU to create equal access by meeting accessibility standards. And it's implemented in a specific way by each European country. So the Act itself is not the law. I'm going to use the example of Ireland, my home country, and talk about what the law is there, which is coming up to a scenario where if you didn't do anything, you could face up to 60,000 euro fines or 18 months in jail. Really substantial punishments and penalties for this. But that would be if you didn't take any action in response. So the legal process can be started in Ireland by consumers who have a problem. And then if you act on those things, your defense is, we've taken the precautions, we're acting on accessibility feedback, the due diligence is done, and that's what's going to give that business a defense for responding to something that otherwise could end up in fines. I am not a lawyer. I'm sort of the opposite of a lawyer, and I think that it's very clear you need to talk to your own legal and compliance people. But this might be the first time that you're hearing about this act. It affects a lot of companies, so it really is worth having that conversation internally, asking if this affects you, if this is something you need to consider testing. Now we'll talk about accessibility and test automation. So automation has been used for accessibility testing for a really long time, because there's lots of things that are really automation friendly to test, and problems can arise often rooted in the concept that the code serving a web page doesn't match the content on the page or the state of the content on the page or reflect the actions that you can do on that page. So anything where what's expected from an accessibility perspective is not met compared to what it visually looks like, automation is really good to detect these things. At the end of the day, the underlying idea of accessibility automation is that it matters which HTML we ship to users. It doesn't always feel like that, especially if you're newer to front-end development and you get started. You can build up user interfaces with a lot of generic elements and make something that looks nice and matches Figma, but doesn't have the internal structure that would make sense for assistive technology to describe that. This is, I think, a common problem even in well-established developers with long careers, or full-stack developers who just come to the front end every now and then. Unless you've been exposed to the need for accessibility, it's unlikely that you're going to know what to do or even where to look and how to find that stuff out. This is an example of how the accessibility is implemented by browsers. So if we take a look on the left-hand side here, we've got this like button. It's a thumbs up. And the HTML code for this is a button that's wrapping this SVG image of the thumb logo. This is going to create something in the browser called the accessibility tree. The accessibility tree is how other technology taps into what's happening underlying the page. So this button is going to create a button node that has no name because there's no text in there. That's in the middle here. And then all these downstream technologies like screen readers and voice controls and braille displays, anything else, is going to have a harder time identifying to the user what might happen. It's just an unlabeled button. It could close the application, it could submit your credit card details, it could do anything. So it might as well not be functional if it doesn't have a label. Because this is easy to detect with code, this is easy to detect with analysis of the button doesn't have a label. It's also really easy to satisfy that analysis by doing something like an ARIA label. We'll look at some other examples later. But this is a technique that is acceptable to label a button without changing the visual appearance. So now it's just got that little bit of detail in the code. The browser is going to form that into the accessible name for that button in the accessibility tree. And this is the type of thing we're hoping to be successful with when we automate accessibility testing. But as I said, accessibility is hard. Why don't developers just do this in the first place on everything? It's because accessibility is hard. Code is changing often. Each change can have effects on the accessibility of the application, and those changes will affect the usability and the independence of your users in understanding and completing tasks that are part of your app. Developers who write code and the testers aren't always informed and aware of all of the accessibility things that might be going on. It's a lot of things to check every time. And if you're merging multiple PRs per week or per day, it's very difficult to imagine in real time doing that kind of manual validation, just the same way you don't do this manual validation all the time when you're doing your traditional builds. You use traditional test automation for that. The other problem is if you are not aware of accessibility at the start of a project, you can implement patterns on top of patterns on top of patterns, where there's an accessibility problem that's kind of load-bearing and really difficult to unstick, because now you're using a component that implements an incorrect pattern in multiple places, and fixing it requires adjustments in all these other places. So it actually can be harder to unstick an application that is built in an inaccessible way than it is to build the same application in an accessible way, which will be faster than actually building it all custom anyway. So accessibility, as we said, if we're doing it from the start, it's a lot easier. This is why shift left has become so important in accessibility testing, because we can detect these things in the automation pipeline, and it's way easier to fix an accessibility issue while a pull request is open and that developer is already changing the code and they have all the context they need. It's way easier and faster to do that than it is to have the bug reach production and be detected there, and then it becomes a ticket and it goes in the backlog and it's prioritized against other bugs, and we're talking about, well, how many disabled users do we have and what's the compliance standard? And there's a whole cloud of things that happen around an accessibility issue. If the developer already knew about it, though, it would be fixed in less time than it takes to make the ticket and put it in Jira. So shift left is very valuable for accessibility. Here's a little bit about how automation works. So there's several different approaches to automation for accessibility. There's production monitoring and there's code linters. All of those have their place. We're really going to focus on this area. And these three things, right, using specific locators, doing customized accessibility specific checks, and then also having these generic and static checks. All three of these are discussed in the Cypress docs now. There's a new accessibility testing guide that we just published, but this is the one that we're talking about in this talk, which is how you can run scans in your Cypress pipeline to find accessibility bugs, and then some examples of how we're going to fix them. The most popular library for doing this type of work is Xcore. This is probably the one that you've already seen and been interested in. A couple of questions came up in the chat yesterday about this. So this is used by Lighthouse, which is another common thing people do for accessibility testing. It's implemented in various places, and our examples using Cypress Accessibility are using Xcore under the hood. So the way it phrases rules, the resources it gives you, all those types of things are probably familiar if you've done any accessibility testing before. There's a certain set of things that static analysis can check for. I thought it was important to include this because it is not going to catch every possible accessibility issue. You need manual testing, you need users actually using it, just like you do for all other testing. Like your authority on your success of your usable application is always your users. So it does take certain success criteria from the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And there's about 30% of those that are friendly for this kind of automation. A lot of the others are more equality kind of ideas around human judgment or certain kinds of content and certain cognitive accessibility things that are harder to automate. They're not like missing labels. But when we see clear failures, Xcore and Lighthouse and everything can tell you, you are definitely failing this success criteria because you've missed the label for this form field or this button, so it's not going to be described in assistive technology. It's really easy to find the absence of these things and tell you what's missing so you can correct it, and that happens all the time. On the other hand, these tools do not prove 100% compliance. That's not their purpose, and it's error detection. So we'll take a look at this in action. I'm using the example of the Cypress real-world app, which I introduced some accessibility problems to, and we're going to take a look and fix some of those. The elements on the screen here are coming from Cypress Accessibility. I'm going to flip over and show that, and we'll use it for some debugging, but this first one is going to be just with the slides. So here we can see what a user is getting when they receive an accessibility report in Cypress Cloud. It's based on test replay, which you just saw in the last talk, which means this is like a live interactive thing. It's not an image or anything like that. And so we can use this to debug, and I'll show what that workflow is. And I'll also show the reporting interface where we can see, okay, here are the rules that were failing during this, and here's the pages that were tested and stuff like that. The general concepts here apply to any form of accessibility testing, so we'll use the cloud as our example, but nothing that you would learn here is restricted to just applying it in this context. The background for this is this form that we were just looking at here with the username and password was a material UI form in React, and it had a label that was inside the text field. And so I decided I don't like that. A better design is to put the label outside so it doesn't disappear when the user starts typing. It's a good idea for accessibility anyway. And then I make this PR, and Cypress Accessibility is now yelling at me because there's two accessibility issues that were introduced, and we have to go through the process of debugging. So first, I did that same thing that we just did in the browser there. I took a look to see what's happening and what's going on with the label. It appears visually to have a label, so I'm satisfied this should be good enough. We need to get it to the code. We can print this element to the console by whatever means that we want to, and then we can come over and take a look at that. Here's the element itself. I can see it's a standard input. It has an ID and a username. These are signals that it's probably going to be accessible because you need those to hook into with your label. But it still doesn't have anything that's labeling it, so let's take a look at what's going on there. The browser has a built-in rendering of the accessibility tree. This is part of Chrome DevTools, and not everybody is aware of this. But in this case, we can see various things that are present in the accessibility tree. And as I said, these are used by assistive technology to provide navigation and to make stuff that makes sense for users with disabilities. Here we can see this form field definitely has an empty name. So we're perfectly clear here, the report from Xcore was correct, and we're going to debug it. My next step is to look at the username element. The username element immediately stands out because it doesn't have a for attribute. And so for me, I'm familiar enough with accessibility. It's like, that's the end of my debugging. I know that that's going to work and that's missing, and we're kind of done now because we've seen that other part of the DOM. But somebody who's not as familiar could go through, click on the Learn More link for this particular issue, and see the DQ University stuff that comes with Axe Core. This tells you various ways that you can do it. This is the exact first example in here. This also tells you who's affected by this, so you can consider that in the way that it's labeled and the experience it's supposed to provide. So if I have that information, I'm going to understand. I need to use the for attribute here. And this is done. Let's see what happened to the accessibility tree. The accessibility tree is happy now. The for attribute wires up that label element to that form field. And now if you're listening to this form described out loud, you know where you're supposed to put your username and where you're supposed to put your password because we fixed this relationship. In terms of the report, if you were to run Cypress Accessibility again or your other accessibility scan, at the bottom we can see these two rules are green that are related to form fields. At the top they were failing and they had two elements. So we have confidence that this is an issue that we have fixed for now, and we would get alerted again if we introduced a regression. I have a couple of observations from going through a fix like this. First of all, long forms are even more challenging than these short forms. If you have a credit card application or some other multi-step process, there's many different problems that could be happening, and it's easy to make a form that's just non-functional, that's very difficult to listen to and understand if you're not visually seeing it, what you're supposed to type in where. So you can fully block people from independently using your software this way. Forms are particularly important for accessibility because it's probably how people contact you and how they give you money and how they sign up for things on your platform. So they're a very attentive place to be for accessibility, and they have a lot of state and variations as you create errors and have required fields and things like that. So forms deservedly get a lot of attention from accessibility. I want to take a look and see if we can solve a couple more of these before we kind of wrap up, and I will take a look in more depth at this one here with the buttons. So here's the example that we had of the accessibility tree already, right? We have this button issue, and I'm going to look at that in the browser as well. And we'll go through that debugging process that I described. What we see on the left, it says buttons must have discernible text. There's a range of things that Axe Core provides as solutions for this, and we want to get into the browser and debug it. So the process, as much as it looked like there was a lot of steps, we can see in here this button. I already did the attribute that I needed to do, so I'm going to take that out. We can see in here that this button has that behavior in the accessibility tree. This is the reason that it was complaining, because it didn't have discernible text. And so what we can see here, the accessibility tree also says there's no discernible text. And the solution that we get, the one that I had used, was this Axe Core solution in here, this technique that doesn't require putting text in the button. So in the browser, we can do this type of debugging. I can come over, I can add the attribute, test it out. It was aria label, like this transaction. Something like that is fine. And we can see it's populated down here like we'd expect. So we'd be confident that if we made this change in our code, the next test run would not have this accessibility problem. And I have the code open here as well, so we can come in and we can actually put these labels on there. And so all I did was I added this HTML4 in this label in this React component. I don't want to spend much time on like how React works or anything like that, but this is the code where I added the label. It was missing this for attribute, and it's now wired up to match this text field. So the next time we run Cypress Accessibility by running our tests in the cloud, this thing should be passing. And we're going to try to fix one or two other things before we do that. That's the output that we're going to expect from Cypress Accessibility. In the bigger report that this snapshot was taken from, there's actually two different variants of the element that were detected with a violation. There's a disabled state and there's a primary state that's active. And in total, there were 50 different page states and page variations that reflected this button existing somewhere. So that single one-line change that we could make to fix the button is going to be something that we can do that also applies to all 50 places that that button was being used. Now we're going to take a look at the alt text for an image. So here We've got one more issue. And this is showing us a particular image in the real world app. These profile images don't have alt text, and it's actually showing up for a lot of them. So here we have the alt text for these two images in here, and we can switch. There's a whole different place where there's other images that are missing alt text as well. And the question is, like, what do we need to do about this? Is it functional and meaningful to add the correct missing alt text, which would be like the name of the person or a description of this particular image? That's usually the purpose of alt text. In my experience, there's a little bit of a debate about profile images in general, but here, where they're just reflective of the names that are already in the UI, it's probably not necessary to fix this with a band-aid that just puts on the accessible name to say, okay, this is this person's name and this person's name. If you were listening to this page described, that would just be repetition with no new information. So here, I think the solution is actually going to be to remove the alt attribute, and we can see the effect of that in the DevTools as well. And so basically what I'm seeing here is that it's generic, it says image, there's no name in here, and that I'm treating this as kind of noise that we want to remove. So one of the techniques for doing that is to say alt is empty. In this case, just an alt attribute is fine. And down in the accessibility tree, we see this is switched to ignored. So the next time that we would run this image is not going to trigger a violation in Axe Core. It's correctly ignored. We don't have to make up an alt text for it. We're going to treat this as decorative. So that is the process I would go through to decide, okay, how do we want to handle this? And so even though Cypress accessibility is telling us that there is an accessibility issue here, it's not telling us exactly what we're supposed to do about it. That's this takeaway. We can fix all of these by removing the alt attributes in the code. Let's actually flip over to the code and do that as well. So here I know that I had this teed up to add this attribute empty to both of these avatar components. And I also had this teed up over here where we have some other places. So let's get that button icon back in because we did the password and the username, but we didn't do this button. Cool. And so now we've added this to these other two avatars as well. And for the sake of this demo, I just had that teed up because I didn't want to spend time like looking through for exactly which test IDs would match and spend our time on the code itself. So these are all now teed up and fixed, and the expectation should be when Cypress accessibility runs, we'll get this there. So what I'm actually going to do is kick off a run now while we talk about the rest of this, and we'll take a look at what the results are. So this is my local machine is going to run with these code changes that I've saved, and we might make a commit here, just changing these 3 files. And we'll just say fix issues again. So I'm not pushing up to CI, I'm just kicking this off from local so we have an example of what to look at. It's going to start to run Cypress and record the test to the cloud. We're going to expect this output anyway, that these are going to actually be fixed in our new report. And when we looked at the images, as I said, we decided these were noise. So we decided we're going to remove them from the accessibility tree, not put repetitive text all throughout the application every time one of those is used as a visual signifier of a user. In certain situations, the profile image is the only way that you can learn about the visual presentation of somebody. So this is something that accessibility professionals in different contexts would say you should describe in rich detail exactly what a person's profile image is, because it's a part of how they're presenting themselves online. In this context, I'm just saying it's noise, but the main thing here is it's a human decision of how to react to what the automation has told you. And that's actually a common thread as we decide what we're going to do with different things that are findings in an accessibility scan. And we don't have to jump to the first band-aid that comes to mind. We can use that as a signal that there's something in there that needs a human decision to give the best experience based on what we think people are going to need, and then let user feedback guide us from there. So this run had completed in the cloud. I'm going to click to open this here. Let's make sure we grab the URL. And here we have the accessibility process. This was just from 1 minute ago. So we can come over here and we can look, did those solutions make a difference? What's happening with the button rule? I have to turn this filter on because the button is fixed. That's good. We can search again for form fields. This label element rule is passing as well. And we can look at what was the impact of those two code changes on the images. This is also passing. So that went from those 18 elements that had different failures for alt text. None of those are included now. This is considered passing because every image in the run has the appropriate alt attribute in one way or another. So this is a pretty quick way to get local feedback if you're using something like this. And that's what you can expect after you fix the issues. The other topic was like, how do we deal with more than this small number? Because it's okay when you already have a knowledge of what you want to do, and like I do, I have a certain set of issues that make sense to show, but sometimes they're more complicated and they're harder to solve. What we've seen with teams we've worked with at Cypress is that you can scale accessibility testing down to just what the team is ready for, just like when you adopt a linter or something else. So you can have accessibility testing that is driven by particular issues like button labels, something that's easy to get started with, and you can expand what's happening from there. So getting started and getting something into the pipeline and letting the team experience success is really good. On the other hand, turning on the fire hose if you have a big backlog of issues and forcing developers to bounce back and forth between every conceivable accessibility issue that might happen and try to require that level of perfection at the start is a recipe for disaster. People will be frustrated. They won't learn things consistently. It's often better to find those things that you can win, that are quick wins and easy to fix, and just focus on those. And then at the bottom, you can also do some sorting and filtering if you have these merged result sets where you can understand which issues are most common and highest impact to fix. And that can also be another way to focus your prioritization. So these types of static checks that we just showed that reveal things with Axe Core, you have really two paths you can do in Cypress. What I showed was Cypress accessibility in the cloud. The state of the art until now has been doing things in the test. So that's what we've got on the left-hand side here. Cypress Axe is a package that's been around since 2018, and it's been the standard way to run accessibility tests in Cypress, I would say. There's a newer package built on top of that called Wick Ally, which came out recently, and Sebastian, who created that, he's not here today, but he did a great job creating a more visual layer on top of Cypress Axe that can be used for debugging in some cases as well. And he's done a great job getting the word out and having people be more aware of accessibility testing in Cypress, which is fantastic. Then there's other different libraries than Axe Core, like IBM Equal Access and a few other different ones as well that can run in a Cypress environment. The way all of these work is you execute checks as part of the test itself when it runs. So you maybe manually add something to the test to cause this check to happen, or you decide you're going to do it just at the start of the test or something like that. When there's violations, your main option is to just fail that particular test at that point. And then you manage your own reporting. You might, if you don't fail the test, you might have to do something else. And I've seen all kinds of different kind of scaffolding for this. The difference between that and what you just saw with the server-side processing is these checks run in Cypress Cloud. As the test is recorded, like we just spun up that recording and kicked it off. Everything on the cloud happened regardless of the test code. There was no test code related to accessibility checks in the Cypress real-world app tests. Results show up in Cypress Cloud and Slack and GitHub, and there's also an API so you can fail CI under specific rules. All the results merge into one report for pages and components that were reached in the test. I'm deliberately not spending too much time on this because Brian also explained a lot of this yesterday in his talk. So if you missed that, you can check that out for kind of more details on the cloud. This is just a summary of how this is going to work in the InTest plugin. The sci.checkAlly command from Cypress Axe is a common one that can give you accessibility feedback in the test itself. The equivalent using Cypress accessibility is developers don't know anything about that. They just write their normal tests, and we pick up all the states as these things are recorded based on the test replay data that's coming in. So as you saw, that gives you a full replay of every test, so it naturally sees all the states and variations of pages, and no one has to think about when to run the accessibility checks. We do have a couple things that are coming up as well. What I showed of the looking at the report for a run is just step one of what's coming, where we'll be able to compare two runs. This work is about to reach production validation, so I'll be looking at this in the next couple of weeks and should come out pretty soon after that. This is going to help us reveal if a developer is introduced to new accessibility problems. So you can do that by comparing two reports manually now, or by having a super clean report in any premise, any tool, and being able to know, okay, we had 100% passing, so any deviation is a problem. But most companies, most businesses are in the state where they have partial compliance and partial accessibility success. And so seeing what you've specifically changed on a given branch is really useful. The next thing we're going to do that we're spiking into now, so I don't have a timeline for this specifically, but within the Axe Core world and within the world of static checks in general, the way they learn about the accessibility of what they're testing is through analyzing the DOM. It's a single moment in time, we get a sense of what the accessibility is. In Cypress Cloud, because we're recording the test along with the accessibility checks, we also know things about your user's intentions. How do you click an element? Do you type into an element? Across all of your tests, how do you treat something? And how does that map back into an accessibility expectation? So where we're going with this is being able to identify more and more elements that you are treating as interactive in your tests, or that you are treating in a certain way that implies something about accessibility, so that the generic divs and spans with click handlers that are being used in the more naive way to make these shapes from Figma that have interactions, that those are going to be revealed through your testing, even if they're not coded correctly. And it should let us pick up a lot more of things that might get through existing kind of approaches to this. So we'll get to the end here, and I just have a few things. The main thing about all of this automation stuff is that your user still needs to be at the center of it. So with Cypress, you're writing tests that emulate user behavior. It puts the user in the center anyway. But we need to always be thinking about what they need from the design and development point of view. And we can't replace somebody who requires assistive technology and uses it on a daily basis, telling you what is wrong and what you need to fix. Automation is there to help you catch things that would impact that experience earlier. They don't have to get to your users if they can be caught with automation, so it makes it massively cheaper and faster. And in addition to these Axe Core checks, you can add a lot to your Cypress pipeline that we haven't really talked about just by writing regular regression tests in Cypress that specify something that has a downstream effect in the accessibility tree. So if you do get a bug reported, you can write a pretty convincing regression test for that related to accessibility, even if you're not doing an Axe Core check that would catch it. Just normal Cypress testing is good for it. When you're looking into accessibility automation, it's key that it supports the larger process. So whatever you implement here needs to connect with what are the other teams doing with accessibility, what are your goals. Shifting as far to the left as possible is great. If you can get pre-production feedback, that's ideal. And then staying out of the way as much as possible. So your system should communicate accessibility issues in the best way at the appropriate time without necessarily causing unrelated things to fall over. So your general functional test pipeline doesn't have to fail or have flake or delays while accessibility is being checked. If you can devise a system to report that externally, so that you can let those functional tests complete and still get all the accessibility feedback all at once that you want. The main thing is just start. So Merrill Evans describes this process of caring about progress over perfection for accessibility. She's got a great blog post about this. And we're not going to ever get to a perfect state. I would say if you're curious about this and you want to understand the difficulty, the pile of work, even if you do see a lot of issues, it's not always as big as it seems because we have these modern component-based systems. So you can do a lot very quickly, especially if you just dive in and try some stuff and then see what the effect is of that. So I encourage people to not be intimidated by accessibility, even though there is a lot to learn as you grow and there's lots of nuance that we didn't get anywhere near today. But just getting started, trying some stuff, understanding how to put links on, names on links and buttons and things like that, you can make an impact right away. So that brings me to the end of my talk. Thank you very much for your time. And if you're interested in any more of this, you can always reach out to me on LinkedIn or talk to your contacts at Cypress, and we can follow up on any accessibility topics.
Thank you so much, Mark. The audience is giving you a lot of virtual claps because overwhelming positive feedback on the presentation. Thank you so much for your insights. As we shift into Q&A, I did have a question for you. when we talk about shift left, there is almost always conversation around the cultural shifts that are required to make those types of initiatives possible. Do you think there's similar cultural shifts that are needed for A11Y initiatives? And if so, how can individual contributors kind of start those shifts off? What can they do to get the conversation going?
There is. So the cultural change in companies, like everybody seems to have to go through an accessibility transformation. And it reminds me a lot of when mobile first became a thing, which some people here are going to be too young to remember, but there was a time when every website had a mobile version separate from a different, a desktop version. And there was this transformation with design all the way through to start making new projects where responsiveness was just embedded in the expectation for the design. Accessibility seems to grow from a similar pattern of like that shift needs to happen in the organization where it's just going to be default. We expect this to happen in design, in requirements, in product, and in development. And there's a grassroots path to that where internally a team will advocate and show the path and like generate some reports and achieve some momentum that way by highlighting risk to the business. On the other hand, there's businesses where this is top down because they already know about the risk, they're in education or they receive government funding. Like in the US, there's lots of law around accessibility if you receive any government funding. So the grassroots approach where individual developers care about accessibility, I think takes longer to achieve the cultural change. And there are various arguments you have to push for that, but also being able to demonstrate progress is really good. So my one example of this in my previous job was color contrast. I changed our brand color in our project because we served people. It was not accessible. It was not meeting color contrast, guidelines, but also people used our product in their cars. And I was like, look, no matter what you think of accessibility, we can get a win for everybody because this is not going to look good in bright sunlight. And that kind of argument got at least one thing in there. So being a little creative in, what are the use cases you serve can also help.
Excellent. I'm going to go ahead and share some questions from the audience. The first one is when creating test cases, what use cases can a QA think of when they're designing those test cases?
So the broad use case I think of the most is the accessibility of your major user flows. So anywhere that you're testing login, contact forms, purchasing processes, those standard things, if you also consider accessibility in those, you only have to do it once. There's a tendency to repetitively check accessibility across multiple different tests. But if you make a dedicated accessibility flow that just analyzes the keyboard behavior or looks for the labels for screen readers, on those major flows, that's a great thing to do. And then in these other flows, and even on those major flows as well, the Axe Core kind of static check approach can still give you valuable feedback about the accessibility of the application you're testing, and just kind of across the board give you a sense of what's going on. The other thing I think people miss a lot with those checks is states that are more than one step in. So we often run an accessibility check on the page load, but not after we open the header nav and not after we get into step 2 of a multi-step form, and especially in modals. And I think confirmation modals are some of the most important parts of the UI. They're often acknowledging a really important legal matter or something else like that that needs to be documented. And if that was not accessible, those are particularly risky areas to make sure to test.
Excellent. Those are good points. Let's go ahead and move on to the next question here. And this is about Cypress accessibility as a feature. Is it WCAG 2 supported?
Yes. So based on Axe Core's definitions and rules that it comes with, WCAG 2.1, 2.2, 2.0 are all kind of encompassed in the Axe Core, and it can be configured to match that. It's worth pointing out this doesn't catch every criteria within those WCAG guidelines. It's going to catch the things that are automation friendly that I talked about. But yes, you can configure it to target WCAG 2, AA, AAA, single A, whatever you need to.
Excellent. And along those similar lines, we have another question from the audience asking about what limitations Cypress accessibility might have. What are scenarios that it couldn't cover?
So one is kind of what I talked about at the end, where we have HTML code that's so distant from its intended purpose that it's not got something to pick up on by Xcore. So sometimes a div with a click listener in JavaScript, that might be your button or your card component or something like that. But to an automation tool, it's going to look like a generic element and just content. So that's a typical thing that would be missed. There's also everything that is kind of editorial and content-based in nature, I think is the best way to put this. And what I mean by that is we can say there's no alt text on the image, but we can't say the alt text on the image is correct in context and help someone independently understand what that image is for and what they're supposed to learn from it. That's a human judgment thing about the purpose of that image. So those are the types of things that are harder to automate. And when you do find a missing image or something like that, missing alt text, you need to think about its actual purpose more as a content editor than as a programmer, I think, and get the right content in there.
Excellent. So we've had a lot of questions about and a lot of discussion in the chat on accessibility experiences and just interest and passion for making applications that cover this parallel equality. So our next question kind of follows that theme and is wondering if there are any QA professional related certifications that folks can get for accessibility.
I'm not sure about QA specifically. The resource that comes to mind is DQ University, which doesn't exactly have certifications as far as I'm aware, but it gives you a good grounding in the accessibility topics. There are other accessibility kind of courses you can take, and they're more geared towards people who are doing accessibility audits and not strictly a QA specific audience. I think from a QA perspective, it's really depending upon how accessibility responsibility lives in your organization. Sometimes if you're the one who has to report it, you're the one who has to do the screen reader manual testing, and you need to understand all of that in addition to the existing kind of functional testing that your organization does. So it's a good idea to look into that, though. If we find a good QA-focused accessibility resource, I'll be sure to share it out in a newsletter or one of our upcoming blogs or something like that.
Thanks, Mark. And this is going to be our last question. So our last question from the audience kind of digs into the weeds of some of the legal precedents you talked about. How does the new European Act compare to WCAG?
There's a slightly different subset of WCAG that seems to be prevalent in the European legislation. In terms of automation, it actually seems to be very much overlapping. But Xcore, for example, has the WCAG tags, and then it has some tags that are prefixed with EN for a certain mapping of those WCAG tags into the European Accessibility Act type references. So there's a relationship there around the world. Most things point to WCAG in one way or another. And then there's additional accessibility things that aren't a part of WCAG that might be more strict in the EU compared to the US or something like that. But most of the stuff that's automatable, labels and structure and things like that would be common to both.
Okay. Well, I appreciate, Mark, all of your time. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us.